Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you're excited for this next segment, but as always, I do want to remind you to leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. You can leave questions as well. I will answer them during the next episode. It's a big support to the network. It's a big support to both me and my fellow podcasters as well. So any tip or donation or even question is highly and greatly appreciated. Now, moving on to the second segment, which should be a very exciting segment for today. Oh, sorry, guys. A Pacers-Celtics Game 2. Now, this has proven to be a very pivotal series for the Boston Celtics and the Indiana Pacers because they're both two very high-scoring teams, and we saw in Game 1 how exhilarating the series could be. I mean, obviously, the Celtics were expecting to kind of win this game a little bit more handily, have more control of this game, but that's just the way the Indiana Pacers play. They never say die. They play a modern brand of basketball that is both exciting and highly tough to defend, especially with the absence of a guy like Kristaps Porzingis for the Boston Celtics, who was huge on the defensive end. And especially having guys like Miles Turner and Pascal Siakam, who are very effective on both ends of the floor, that made this a much closer game than many thought. However, the Celtics will want to make this a clean slate, win a Game 2 for the first time in these playoffs, and looking ahead to the betting odds, they kind of have fallen a little bit to kind of show how the Indiana Pacers can make this a series. So looking ahead to the betting odds for tonight's game, Boston is still favored by 8.5 points. The over-under has drastically risen to 224.5. And the money lines are the Celtics minus 400 and the Pacers plus 300. So you can see how that first game has shifted the kind of betting lines that one would normally think would be more heavily favored for the Celtics. The first game you saw that the Celtics were favored by double-digit points, but now they're not favored. And I think that in Game 2, the Celtics will also face a much tougher questions. Like, how do you combat that paint presence that a guy like Pascal Siakam brings? And that is why these odds I really like, because they represent how physical the series is going to be. The Celtics probably were not expecting a quote-unquote tired Indiana Pacers team to keep the game that close, take it to overtime. So I really respect the odds for this game, and that is why I'm going to take the over in almost every single one. I think that this game is going to be another high-scoring game because both teams have shown that they're going to struggle defensively, especially the Celtics. Now that I mentioned before, Kristaps Porzingis is not in the game. I just think that this is going to be a much more entertaining series than people thought. I also don't think the Celtics will cover the spread. I think that I heavily underestimated the ability for the Pacers to create enough offense to overcome the Celtics' offensive creation. The Celtics being one of the best offenses the NBA has ever seen, I just wasn't expecting the Pacers to kind of level that out, and they absolutely proved me wrong. So that is why I don't think the Celtics will cover the spread as well. I think that they're a huge disappointment. Speaking of someone who has been seen as practically disappointment by pundits and commentators alike, let's talk about fantasy odds, starting with that man again, Jason Tatum. Tonight, I think Jason Tatum is one of those guys who's going to be scrutinized more in real life than in fantasy. Because in fantasy, he's projected to be absolutely incredible, and he has been. Tonight, he is valued on DraftKings at 10,000, and he's projected to have a stellar 56 DraftKings fantasy points. So my big question is, why are people criticizing Jason Tatum when he's performing so well in fantasy? I think that he's a number one option for your fantasy team, and even though some people can say that his 30-plus point efforts do not look as impressive as they should, I still think that in terms of fantasy, he's one of the best options in the league. and he is going to be very critical to how the series is played out, especially in clutch moments. As we saw in Game 1, he hit a clutch 3 in overtime to kind of prove his doubters wrong. But in terms of fantasy, he's always been clutch, at least in the playoffs, and he's starting to prove a lot of fantasy team owners wrong by being the guy you simply can't refuse to put in your lineup. From the Pacers side of things, let's talk about Tyrese Haliburton. He's always been a very interesting quote-unquote superstar, in my opinion, in that he can get hot at any time and he can get cold at any time. Tonight he's valued at 8.3K on DraftKings, and he's projected to have 43 fantasy points. So I think that this is a very fair valuation for Tyrese Haliburton. I think that ultimately we can't necessarily predict how Tyrese Haliburton will play at any given moment. I think his style of play prides itself on being one of aggression, but also one of patience. I think that Tyrese Haliburton realizes that he's not necessarily someone who needs to carry the load. I think that other players can step up around him and create offense for the Pacers. But ultimately, I still think he's very valuable as not necessarily a 1A guy, but a number 2 option for a fantasy team, if you know what I mean. I don't think he's a number 1 guy like Tatum just yet, but he could definitely prove me wrong in the series by being the guy that facilitates the basketball, gets vital buckets for his team, and ultimately leads them to more victories than people thought in this series. So that is why I really like Tyrese Haliburton as a number 2 option. In terms of players who I expect to step up as whether they're role players or pivotal players in the series, I think Derek White is obviously going to be someone to look at. He's obviously not scoring as many points as he did in the first round series, but he is still a very important piece of the Celtics offense. Do I think he's as valuable in fantasy as he was 2 rounds ago? Certainly not. But he's still someone who can get some vital points. I still think he's a valuable asset as a utility person for a fantasy team. He's another body that you can stick in your fantasy team. And he's just a very important player in this series as well. On the Pacers end, I think Pascal Siakam is starting to become another number 2 option for the Pacers and for your fantasy team as well. He's very vital right now, especially on both ends of the floor, just being dominant whenever he's switched onto Al Horford, who simply can't combat that level of size and presence in the paint. Pascal Siakam, for as long as Kristaps Porzingis is out of this series, I think was going to continue to feast on those opportunities in the paint. And Miles Turner will be there to stretch the floor as well, so look out for him as well. So ultimately, the way this series will go highly depends on how the Pacers will use their spacing if they have to react to potential Porzingis comeback. As Woj said, he's expected to return by Game 4, but depending on how this series goes, if the Pacers might steal a game, who knows? Maybe Joe Mazzulla reacts a bit faster, but for as long as he is out, expect guys like Pascal Siakam and Miles Turner to put up both huge points fantasy-wise and in game time. So ultimately, you're looking at a series that has huge fantasy implications for both teams and for your own daily fantasy team. But I could talk about this game all day. I said before that in terms of betting odds, it's really reflecting both these offenses and how quickly they can produce and how much space they can create for their players. These are 2 very well-built teams with not many individualistic stars, individual personalities. So ultimately, be sure to always check on a betting line for the series, because I think this is going to be a very volatile betting trend, as we are seeing replicated with these over-unders, replicated with the lower favoring of one team in the Celtics. So yes, I think that this series is going to be very interesting, both fantasy-wise and how you bet. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we have a very exciting segment where we look at another conference in terms of fantasy college football implications. Yes, we'll be talking about the ACC, another conference that has undergone a lot of change. And I'm going to be looking at 3 specific teams and some players from both those all 3 of those teams rather, that I think will make a huge impact for your fantasy team come the start of the college football season. So we'll be right back to talk about that.